So in today's lesson, we're going to carry on with algebra and we're going to stick with expressions and look at how we expand single brackets, okay? So again, in keeping with expressions, we're not actually looking to solve anything or to find what the letters are in any of these. As I said, with them being expressions, there are no equals and therefore we can't solve them. So we're only looking to write them in a different form. What happens when you expand brackets, or sometimes it's called multiplying them out, you're actually getting rid of the brackets, okay? And the rule for this is to simply multiply all the terms inside the brackets by the term that is on the outside. I've also done a previous video on multiplying terms in algebra, so it's also a good idea to have a look at that as well before tackling some of these questions, just as a refresher what happens when we multiply terms in algebra as well as our rules of indices. Okay, so keeping in mind what we've been asked to do and our basic rule here to multiply the terms inside the bracket by the term on the outside. If I look at my first example, I've got 2 upon a plus 3, okay? So that means I have to multiply both these terms, the a and the 3, by the term that's on the outside. So I'm going to multiply 2 times a to get my first term, so 2 times a. Very simply in algebra is just written as 2a. And I also have to multiply this second term in the bracket as well by the 2 that's on the outside. Alright, so 2 times 3 is just 6 plus 6. Now, for this first number of examples, everything's positive, and that's straightforward enough, and that the signs and so on will just stay as a positive. We will encounter some that involve negatives later on, and I'll explain what happens in that, as well as it's also covered in the previous video when we look at multiplying terms and we're dealing with positives and negatives. So again, that's why it's a good idea to recap on those. Moving on to our second example, I've got 2b and 4 on the inside of the bracket and a 3 on the outside. So I'm going to multiply both these terms by the 3 that's on the outside. So 3 times 2b, very simply 6b. Okay, so it's just 3 times 2, and we're remembering to add the b in as well. For the second term, 3 times 4, which is just plus 12. And it's always important that you have the letters in that are relevant as well for each question. In these types of questions, these will typically be worth perhaps 2 marks, and you get a mark for each term being correct, as well as the sign included where there are positives and negatives involved. Moving on, where we have a letter on the outside of the bracket rather than a number, the rule is exactly the same. So I'm going to multiply the c and the 1 that's inside the bracket by the c on the outside, starting with the c times c. So c times c, if we remember our rules of indices, c times c simplifies to c squared. Okay? And that's important. It's not the same as 2c, and again it's explained in the previous video. I'm going to multiply the second term as well, the 1 by c. So 1 times c is just 1c. But if we remember, when we have a 1a, a 1b, or a 1x, it's best written as just the letter on its own. We don't need the 1 in front of it. Okay? So c squared plus c is my final answer for that one. Alright? Moving on. Again, something very similar. We've got a letter and a number on the outside of the bracket, so I'm going to multiply both the 3d and the 5 by the 2d that's on the outside. So we'll start off with 2d times 3d. Okay, so do 2d times 3d, do the numbers first. 2 times 3 is 6, d times d is d squared. Okay, moving on to the second term, so 2d times 5, well, it's just the same as what we were doing earlier. 5 times 2d is 10d. Okay? Plus 10d. Next, okay, and again, it's where our rules of indices come in. We've got an e and an f on the inside of the bracket and an e squared on the outside. So we'll start off with multiplying the e squared by the first term inside the bracket, which is an e. E squared times e simplifies to e cubed, because essentially that means e times e times e. Alright? Then we're multiplying the e squared by the second term in the bracket, which is an f. E squared times f is plus e squared f. And that's all it is. I've had questions asked before, would it matter if I wrote FE squared? No, I mean, you'll still get the mark if you write that. It's just good practice, I suppose, in algebra to keep the letters in alphabetical order. But if you wrote E squared F or FE squared, you'll still get the mark. Okay, moving on to our 6th example. Okay, so again, one where we've got a number and a letter on the outside. So I'm going to start by multiplying 3g by 2g squared. So start with the numbers. 3 times 2 is 6. G times g squared is g cubed. Alright. I'm taking our time and doing them nice and slow like this, and using the arrows means we don't skip anything out. 3g times 6 for the next term inside the bracket is simply 18g. Okay. Now, number 7, we're now encountering one where we have a negative on the inside. Okay, so we'll start off with the first term. We'll deal with the negative in a wee second. So for the first term, 4h times 2h. So 4 times 2 is 8. H times h is h squared. So that's the first term dealt with. Okay. So for the next term, I'm doing 4h times minus 3i. Okay. So 4 times minus 3. Now, just a quick recap when we're multiplying in algebra. Okay, if we multiply two positives, we get a positive. If we multiply a positive times a negative, we get a negative. Negative times a positive, we get a negative. And if we ever multiply two negatives give us a positive. That's something you need to learn when you're multiplying or dividing terms in algebra. And again, it's touched on in the previous video where we look at multiplying terms. So if we go back to the question, this is a positive and this is a negative. So a positive times a negative gives us a negative. Okay, so this is going to be a negative term. So back to what we're doing. 4 times 3 is 12, minus 12 of course. And h times I, hi. Okay, so 8h squared, take away 12i. And that's that, all right? Again, with example 8, we're dealing with signs, okay? So we'll look at the first terms that we're multiplying together. So we've got minus 3j times 2j. So this time we're doing a negative times, this is a positive term, so a negative times a positive. A negative times a positive gives us a negative, okay? So we know we're starting off with a minus when we multiply this out. 3 times 2 is 6. J times j is j squared, so minus 6j squared, okay? Now move on to our second term. Alright, so we've got a minus times a minus. So again, just back to our rules. When we're dealing with a minus times a minus gives us a positive. Okay, so we're going to have a plus here. 3 times 4 is of course 12, a positive 12 because we multiplied two negatives. And don't forget our j that we're multiplying into this as well. Alright, so minus 6j squared plus 12j is our final answer. And again, just one more example just to demonstrate that if we have three terms inside the bracket like this, it's the same thing. We're just multiplying each of these three terms by the 4a that's on the outside. So 4a times a is 4a squared. 4a times 2b, so multiplying the numbers first. 4 times 2, made these all positive, but again where there's positives and negatives, just use our rules here. 4 times 2 is 8 ab, not forgetting our letters, plus, and we'll go for the last term, so we're doing 4a times 3c. 4 times 3 is 12 ac. Okay, and that's our last example covered. Now again, there will be some examples at the end of the video for yourself to try. I hope I've covered enough here to give you some confidence in doing these. And again, the best way to improve with these types of questions is practice. And anything you're unsure about, just ask. I will, for those who's doing the higher level examinations, also cover multiplying out two brackets and how we use FOIL to do so, as well as encountering equations that involve single and double brackets as well when we come to that.